Close your eyes for a moment.
Not all the way, not yet. Just enough to let the edges of the world soften, let the sharp corners of your day grow dim and rounded, like river stones worn smooth by 10,000 years of patient water. You are safe here, completely, entirely safe. There is nothing you need to do right now. No decision waiting for you. No message that cannot be answered tomorrow. No weight that you are required to carry through this particular quiet hour. All you need to do, the only task asked of you in this whole long evening, is breathe. Breathe in slowly, through the nose, and notice how the air arrives cool and clean, how it fills that deep hollow behind your sternum, how your shoulders, almost of their own accord, begin their long descent away from your ears. Breathe out, gently, and let something go with it. Whatever it is, it will wait. Because right now, we are going somewhere else entirely. We are going backward, not with a lurch or a leap, but with the gentle, unhurried drift of wood smoke rising on a windless afternoon. We are going back through centuries that have folded themselves, tone upon another, like the pages of an ancient letter sealed with wax and honey. We are going to a garden that the world once called a wonder. Garden built in the sky, suspended between earth and heaven, breathing and alive, watered by the great river below and warmed by the amber sun above. Come. The gate is open. The path is soft underfoot. We are going to Babylon. Before we pass through that ancient gate, before the first warm breath of terraced blossoms reaches you, before your sandals find the smooth stone of the processional path, let us pause here, just for a breath, then the threshold between your world and this one. This space, this doorway, 'tis one that many thousands of weary souls have found their way to, the deep quiet of their evenings. People who arrived here exactly as you did, tired, perhaps, the way that goes deeper than the body. Tired in the place behind the eyes, tired in the slow, steady parts of the heart. And they stayed. They stayed because this garden, this ancient, impossible, fragrant garden, asked nothing of them. It only offered. It offered shadow and water and the low, velvet hum of a world that moved at the pace of growing things, rather than the frantic pace of clocks. If this threshold feels like a place you might wish to return to, and something tells me it will, then there is one small gentle thing you can do. Simply subscribe to this channel and leave a like if the atmosphere settles over you like something familiar, like a shawl you have always owned but only just remembered. That is all. No urgency, no pressure, only a quiet invitation, extended across the years. Keep coming back to these gardens, these rivers, these forgotten and luminous corners of the human story. Now, breathe once more, and let us walk forward together into the amber afternoon of ancient Babylon. The garden is waiting. And it has been waiting, patiently and without complaint, for a very long time. The road that carries you into Babylon is not a road in the way you have always understood roads to be. It is not merely a path from one place to another, not merely a practical solution to the problem of distance. It is a declaration. It is a proclamation pressed into the very earth, wide enough for 4 chariots to roll abreast without their wheels ever touching, paved with great flat stones the colour of old cream and pale sand, stones that have been fitted together with such patient, exacting care that the seams between them are barely wider than the edge of a thumbnail. Beneath your sandaled feet as you walk, you can feel the faint warmth that the stones have been collecting since the early hours of the morning, drawing the heat of the Mesopotamian sun down into their dense, quiet bodies and holding it there, the way a sleeping animal holds warmth inside its fur. The air around you is layered and complex in the way that only the air of a great living city can be. There is the foundational note of the river, the Euphrates, broad and brown and perpetually murmuring to itself as it moves through the flat plain with the slow, purposeful patience of something that has been flowing for longer than any human memory can reach. The river carries with it the green mineral scent of deep water, the cool exhalation of reeds bending at the bank, the faint dark thread of river mud that is not unpleasant at all but rather deeply, primally familiar, the smell of life itself in its most fundamental and elemental form. Layered over the river is the smell of the city, cedar smoke rising from 1,000 cooking fires, the bright, almost astringent sharpness of fresh bread baking in clay ovens, the warm animal presence of donkeys and oxen at the market stalls, the sweetness of date palms that lined certain streets like tall, patient sentinels with their shaggy crowns held high above the rooftops, and threaded through all of it, intermittently like a melody that appears and vanishes and appears again, the faintest whisper of something floral, something green and impossibly fresh, something that seems to belong to a different altitude altogether, as though a piece of a cooler, higher, more verdant world has drifted down to meet you here on the flat plain of the ancient earth. That is the garden. Already, before you have seen it, the garden is finding you. The processional way, for that is what this road is called, the great processional way of Babylon, is flanked on both sides by walls of deep blue-glazed brick, and those walls are alive with animals that do not breathe, yet seem entirely capable of doing so. Great lions pace along the lower registers of the wall in profile, each one rendered in pale golden yellow against that lapis-deep blue ground, their muscular bodies caught in the eternal mid-stride of creatures that will never quite arrive wherever they are going. Above the lions, in alternating panels, the surrush, a creature of composite wonder, part dragon and part something else entirely, its scaled body flowing forward on 4 sturdy legs, its neck long and graceful as a heron's, its crested head held with an expression that suggests both power and a certain cool intelligence. These are the animals of Marduk, the great god of Babylon, and they are everywhere, watching, pacing, processing along these walls, as though they too are members of this slow and magnificent parade. Your footsteps on the pale stone make almost no sound. The city around you generates its own deep, layered music, the clatter of a potter's wheel turning somewhere behind a wall, the call of a merchant advertising his wares in a voice that rises and falls with practiced musicality, the distant clang of bronze being worked in a smithy, the laughter of children that reaches you in fragments, high and bright and then gone. A cart pulled by a small grey donkey passes you on the left, the wooden wheels describing a low groaning rhythm on the stone, the donkey's large dark eyes calm and patient and entirely untroubled by the grandeur of its surroundings in the way that animals always are, unbothered by the weight of history, interested only in the present moment and the vague, hopeful possibility of water and rest ahead. You look up, and there it is. The great city wall rises before you like a geological event, like a cliff face, like something that has always existed and always will. Its dimensions are almost too large for the mind to process comfortably all at once. The ancient sources speak of walls so wide that 2 chariots could be driven side by side along their tops, of walls so tall that they diminished even the tallest cedars of Lebanon to the scale of saplings, of walls that enclosed not just buildings and streets and temples, but entire fields, orchards, gardens, whole internal landscapes capable of sustaining the city through any siege. The brick of the walls is the colour of the earth itself, warm ochre, deep amber, ruddy orange where the afternoon light strikes at an angle, and embedded at intervals along their face are towers that project outward in regular rhythm, each one crowned with crenellations that cut the sky into neat alternating shapes of solid and void. The Ishtar Gate stands before you. Its name does not quite prepare you for what it is. The name is a sound, a sequence of syllables, but the gate itself is a physical experience that moves through you like warm water. The lapis lazuli blue of its glazed bricks is not simply a colour, it is almost a presence, a quality of light that seems to be generated from within the brick rather than merely reflected off its surface. In the strong afternoon sun of the Mesopotamian plain, the gate glows quite literally with a deep and saturated radiance that makes the surrounding air feel dimmer by contrast, as though the gate is the single lamp in an otherwise ordinary room. The animals march across its surface in yellow and white, row upon patient row, the lions, the surrush, the bulls of Adad, and the decorative borders of palmettes and rosettes between the registers carry an almost obsessive attention to detail. Each repeated element rendered with the same care as the first evidence of craftsmen who understood that beauty is not diminished by repetition, but rather deepened by it. You pass beneath the gate's vaulted arch. The sound of the city changes as you do. The arch gathers the ambient noise and reorganizes it. The way a cupped hand changes the character of water poured into it. You are briefly in the acoustic shadow of something enormous, something that has outlasted the purposes for which it was built and become instead a monument to the simple human compulsion to make things that last, to press the evidence of one's existence into stone and brick and fired clay and say, "Here we were here, this is what our hands could do." And then you are through. The processional way continues ahead of you, narrowing slightly as it leads deeper into the city. The air is warmer here, enclosed by walls on both sides, and carries with it an intensified version of all the city's scents: more cedar, more bread, more river, more stone warmed by the sun, and more clearly now, with every step you take, more green, more floral, more impossibly fresh and alive, the exhalation of the garden, drifting down from somewhere above the roofline to meet you. You're almost there. The afternoon is golden and unhurried, and the garden is calling. Before you can reach the garden, you must first understand the city that holds it. And to understand the city, to truly feel the full weight and wonder of what has been built here on this flat, riverine plain, this ancient land between the two great rivers that the Greeks will one day call Mesopotamia. The land between the waters, you must first lift your eyes to the shape that dominates the horizon with the quiet authority of a mountain. The ziggurat of Babylon. Titamananki. The name means in the old Sumerian tongue something that has been translated as the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. And when you stand at the base of it and allow your gaze to travel upward, tier by receding tier, the small blue-glazed temple chamber at its summit that seems to float against the copper and gold of the afternoon sky, you understand that the people who built this thing were not engaged in mere construction. They were engaged in an act of cosmological aspiration. They were building a seam between two worlds, a physical axis along which the prayers of the earthly city could rise toward the divine, and along which, if the gods were willing, some answering grace might descend. The structure rises in 7 great stages, each one set back from the one below so that the whole forms a stepped pyramid of immense dignity, its silhouette broken by the horizontal lines of each successive terrace, like the written lines of a very large, very patient text. The brick of its lower courses is the deep, warm terracotta of the Mesopotamian earth from which it was fired, and it is old, profoundly, measurably old, worn at the edges by the particular erosion of time and wind and rain, softened in its angularity the way old faces are softened, the sharp geometry of its original construction gradually yielding to something that looks less constructed and more grown. Vines trail down portions of its eastern face, their tendrils finding the small gaps between bricks with extraordinary patience, dark green against the warm orange-red of the clay, each leaf catching and releasing the afternoon light as the intermittent breeze moves through them. At the base of the ziggurat, the scale of human beings becomes suddenly apparent and somewhat humbling. The people moving around its base, priests in long white linen robes carrying folded offerings, scribes with clay tablets pressed against their forearms, group of labourers resting in the shade of the first terrace's recessed wall, are reduced by comparison to something approximate to the scale of beetles moving across a very large hearthstone. Their voices carry up to you in fragments A murmured exchange, a soft rhythmic prayer, the clink of a clay jar set against a stone surface, all of it absorbed and softened by the enormous mass of the structure they move around. The ziggurat taking their sounds the way the sea takes stones, without effort, without alteration to itself. The city spreads away from the ziggurat in all directions with the organized confidence of a civilization that has had long enough to think carefully about where things should go. The streets, from any elevated vantage, reveal a gridded geometry, not the perfect mechanical grid of a later city planned all at once from above, but the lived and adapted grid of a city that has been growing and refining itself over centuries, its original intentions remaining legible beneath the accretions of time and commerce and necessity. The main avenues are wide and oriented deliberately, aligned with the cardinal directions and the movements of significant stars and planets tracked by the astronomers who occupy their own high tower on the northern side of the city. Men who have been recording the movements of celestial bodies on clay tablets for so long that their accumulated observations form a library of cosmic events, stretching back further than any single human life can comprehend. The houses that line the residential streets are built in the local tradition, blank-faced on the exterior, presenting to the street only their mud brick walls, narrow windows high up to catch the breeze while keeping out the direct assault of the afternoon sun, low wooden doors darkened by generations of hands. The real life of these houses happens inside, around the central courtyard that each one contains within its perimeter like a secret garden, an interior sky, a private piece of open air that belongs to the family and no one else. As you pass along certain streets, you can hear these interior lives through the walls. A woman singing at her loom, a high, clear voice following a melody you do not recognize but whose emotional shape you understand entirely. Children arguing in voices that rise and fall with theatrical urgency over some injustice whose stakes are enormous to them and would be, to you, heartbreakingly small. The temples of other gods distribute themselves across the city landscape in no apparent hurry. The temple of Ishtar, goddess of love and war, sits in its own walled precinct to the north, entrance flanked by great lion statues whose stone bodies have been polished smooth at the shoulder by the accumulated touch of 10,000 supplicants passing close enough to reach out and lay their hands briefly against the warm stone, seeking something: luck, love, favor, courage, simply the primitive comfort of touching something larger than themselves and finding it solid and real and present. Now your eyes drift upward again, drawn by that persistent, fragrant invitation on the moving air. The garden occupies a terraced structure that rises along the northern side of the great palace complex, and at this distance from the street it presents itself less as a garden and more as a rumour of green, a stacked, ascending accumulation of vegetation that seems almost hallucinatory in its context, impossibly lush against the dry plain that stretches in every other direction to the horizon. From here you can see the individual crowns of large trees rising above the lower terraces, their canopies full and round, moving softly in the high breeze that does not quite reach the street level where you stand. Flowering vines cascade over the retaining walls of the upper terraces, their trailing lengths catching the afternoon light, the blossoms opening and closing at their own internal pace, indifferent to the immensity of the city around them. The green of it, seen against the warm brick and pale dust of the city below, an almost physical effect on the eye. It is the colour of relief, the colour of water when you are thirsty, the colour of the answer to a question you did not realize you were asking until you heard it spoken aloud. You begin to move toward it now. Your steps are unhurried. The afternoon is still generous with its light, and the garden is patient. Gardens always are. Garden in the sky requires water. This is the first and most inescapable truth of the hanging gardens, the foundational problem that every consideration of this place must eventually arrive at and then attempt to answer. Because water in this flat and ancient plain between the two great rivers does not climb, it does not aspire upward. It does not of its own accord decide to visit the upper terraces where the roses are opening their petals to the morning light, or the shaded corners where the jasmine trails its starred white flowers over the edge of the stone balustrade and releases its perfume into the air in long, slow, invisible ribbons. Water here, everywhere. To bees only gravity. It seeks the lowest point. It moves toward the river and the sea with the patient. It's inevitable logic of all things that understand their own nature. And so the builders of this garden had to teach the water something against its nature. They had to persuade it upward. The mechanism by which they accomplished this is, in its way, as impressive as the garden itself. Along the eastern side of the garden structure, running parallel to the great terrace walls, there exists a system of shafts, wide, square chambers cut vertically through the massive structure, within each of which operates a device of rotating wooden blades and leather-padded chambers that draws water up from the cisterns at the base of the structure and delivers it in a continuous and measured flow. The channels cut into the stone of the uppermost terrace. From there the water begins its long, leisurely downward journey through the garden, the direction it has always preferred, and in doing so it waters every terrace, every bed, every root system in the entire living structure before finally returning, warm and earth-tinted, the cisterns at the base to begin the cycle once more. The sound of this system of water is one of the first things you become aware of as you approach the lower entrance of the garden complex. It is not the sound of a fountain, which is a public and somewhat declarative sound. It is something more private than that, more functional, more deeply embedded in the fabric of the place. It is a low, rhythmic, slightly hollow sound. The sound of water moving through contained spaces, through carved channels and narrow stone pipes. The sound of liquid doing the patient, necessary work of sustaining life in a place where life insists on residing at an altitude above its natural level. The sound is almost subliminal. It registers more in the body than in the mind, like the distant sound of a heartbeat heard through a wall. The main channel that carries water along the first terrace is cut directly into the paving stone and runs along the inner edge of the terrace wall with a precision that speaks of long hours of careful planning, of measurements taken and retaken, off levels established and verified by the same mathematical minds that laid out the processional way and designed the perfect registers of animals along the Ishtar Gate. The channel is perhaps the width of 2 palms placed side by side, its inner surface worn smooth by years of flowing water to the texture of polished marble, its depth sufficient to carry a steady stream without overflow. The water in it, when you crouch and look closely, has a quality that seems almost animate. It is moving, always moving, in the gentle, purposeful hurry of water that knows where it needs to go and is occupied entirely with the business of getting there. Along the channel, at intervals, small stone sluice gates have been installed, each one controllable by a wooden peg that can be inserted or removed to direct the flow toward particular sections of the garden or hold it temporarily, while other areas receive their share. The pegs themselves are worn smooth where countless hands have gripped and turned them, their wood darkened to a rich mahogany by years of water contact and hand oil, each one a small, entirely humble artifact of daily horticultural labour, whose aggregate contribution to the survival of this garden is as significant as anything produced by the famous engineers who designed the overall system. The water source ultimately, essentially, is the Euphrates. The great river is drawn upon through a series of wells along the riverbank, and from those wells the water is lifted by oxen walking in circles at the capstan, their slow, steady revolution, the quiet engine at the heart of this entire living enterprise. Down by the river, at this particular hour of the afternoon, you would find 2 or 3 of these animals at their work, their large dark eyes calm and inward-looking, their enormous hooves leaving deep, rounded impressions in the river mud as they circle and circle with the patient. Almost meditative repetition of beings who have been doing exactly this for so long that it has become simply the rhythm of their existence, like breathing, like the beat of the blood. The water that arrives in the upper cisterns after this long journey of elevation is cool, noticeably, appreciably cool, cooler than the ambient air, cooler than the stone walls it flows beside, cooler than the soil of the upper terraces into which it eventually sinks and disappears among the roots. And this cooling effect radiates outward from the channels as you walk beside them, a gentle, steady emanation of refreshment that modifies the temperature of the air immediately adjacent to the water by a degree or two, a small difference in arithmetic, but a large difference in the body's experience of walking this particular path on this particular warm afternoon. The garden plants understand this. Along the edges of the channels, certain species have migrated over the years closer and closer to the water source, their root systems following the gradient of moisture, with a slow, inexorable tropism that has gradually pulled them from their originally planted positions toward the channels, bending stems, extending lateral roots, positioning leaves to catch any moisture released into the air. The result, along certain sections of the channel path, is a sort of informal honor guard of vegetation, dense, deep green, slightly larger and more vigorous than the plants a few feet further from the water, their leaves holding more moisture than the others, their colouring richer and more saturated, evidence of what it looks like when a living thing is getting exactly as much of what it needs as it can ever use. You run your fingers through the water as you walk, letting it part around your hand and reform behind it with the brief, thoughtless ease of something that cannot remember being divided. It is cold. It is very, very clean. You look ahead, then the green of the garden opens around you like a book. The first terrace of the garden receives you the way a forest receives you. Not all at once. Not with the sudden, theatrical revelation of a view unfolding from a hilltop, but gradually, incrementally, in the slow grammar of increasing shadow and increasing green, in the way that the light changes as you pass beneath the first canopy of leaves, and your eyes adjust to the filtered, softer version of the afternoon that exists inside the garden's outer edge. One moment you are in the full sun of the approaching path, your skin warm, the light sharp and direct. And then there is a tree, a great spreading fig with a trunk the diameter of a man's arm-span. Its bark, a pale silvery grey that catches the light and holds it in the complex topography of its ridges and grooves, and you're in shade, and the shade is layered and cool and full of a greenish, underwater quality of light that turns everything it touches to a slightly different register of itself. The soil of the first terrace is deep. This is immediately apparent not as a fact you have been told, but as a thing you can perceive through the evidence of the plants themselves, through the scale of what has been growing here, and the confidence with which it grows. The trees of the first terrace are not young trees. They have had time, in this garden that has been tended now for decades, to grow into the particular unhurried massiveness of things that have encountered no serious impediment. The fig is the largest, but there is also a date palm whose trunk is deeply ringed with the cicatricial marks of decades of frond removal, each ring a year, a legible autobiography of growth written in the tree's own skin. There is a pomegranate tree whose multiple trunks have woven together at the base into a single writhing structure, their smooth reddish-grey bark twisted around one another with the casual intimacy of things that have been growing in close proximity for so long that they have simply accommodated one another into their structure. Its fruit hangs heavy and round on the outer branches, the skin a deep burnished red-orange, each one catching the filtered light with a slight lustre like small lamps hanging in the foliage. The soil itself, the soil in which all of this grows at an elevation that soil has no natural business being at, is a subject that the engineers of this garden clearly spent considerable time thinking about. It is layered like a carefully considered argument. The lowest layer, closest to the stone of the terrace floor, is a thick bed of reeds laid in criss-crossing patterns, their dried, hollow bodies serving the dual purpose of drainage, allowing excess water to pass through rather than pool and stagnate, and insulation, providing a cushion between the living soil above and the dead stone below. Above the reeds is a layer of broken pottery shards, pale and cream-coloured, fitted together loosely like the most casual of mosaics, adding porosity, continuing the drainage logic, and above the pottery, deep and dark and richly complex in its organic composition, is the soil proper, a mixture of river silt and animal manure and decomposed plant matter worked together by the hands of countless gardeners into something with a texture that is almost velvet when dry, almost clay when wet, possessed of a darkness and a weight that tells you, without need for explanation, that this is where growth happens. that this is where the living and the not yet living conduct their slow, essential transactions. The roots of the fig tree have, over the years, found the drainage gaps in the pottery layer and sent long, exploratory tendrils down through the reeds and into the substrate below, anchoring the tree not just in its soil but in the very structure of the terrace, making the tree and the architecture into a single integrated entity, the living and the built woven together by the patient work of decades into something neither fully one nor fully the other. You kneel slowly without hurry and press your open palm flat against the soil beside the fig's base. It is cool. It is damp, despite the afternoon sun, because the water from the upper channel has been filtering through it since morning, and the deep shade of the canopy above has prevented evaporation. Against your palm you can feel the slight give of good soil, the way it accepts the pressure of your hand without resistance, receiving it the way all well-tended soil receives attention, generously, with a kind of quiet gratitude. There is a smell that rises from the disturbed surface, dark and green and complex, the smell of life in its most patient and fundamental aspect, the smell of all the things that were once alive and have become, through their decomposition, the medium by which other things live. A small brown beetle moves across the surface near your fingers. It is going about its business with the efficient purposefulness of something that has a complete internal map of this small dark world beneath the leaves, world of grain-sized geography and millimetre-scale distances that is as complex and navigable to this beetle as the grid of city streets is to the merchants and priests and scribes moving through Babylon at this very moment, far below the garden's elevated edge. You watch it for a moment, the way its legs operate with such independent, rapid competence, the way its carapace catches a thin stripe of filtered light and returns it briefly as a flash of deep bronze brown, and then it disappears beneath a leaf and the soil is still again and unmarked, though neither you nor the beetle were ever here. Bird song arrives from somewhere within the interior of the garden. 2, possibly 3 different voices overlapping in the way birds overlap when they are not communicating with one another, but simply occupying the same shared acoustic space. Each one engaged in its own continuous musical remark upon the afternoon. One voice is low and repetitive, a liquid churring that seems to originate from somewhere very close to the ground. Another is higher and more intermittent, a series of clear, spaced notes that climb and then descend and then fall silent for a long moment before beginning again. The third voice you cannot quite locate directionally. It seems to come from everywhere within the canopy at once, as though the leaves themselves have taken up the project of making sound. The light in this first terrace moves. It moves as the leaves move because the light can only reach you here as the leaves permit it to, and the leaves permit it in a continuously shifting, continuously renegotiated pattern as the breeze passes through the canopy in slow, billowing waves. The patches of sunlight that reach the soil are not still. They drift and expand and contract and merge and separate with the lazy, unhurried motion of clouds, and the effect of standing within this moving, dappled, shifting light is one of the most deeply peaceful things you have encountered in a very long time, the sense of being gently enclosed, gently animated, gently reminded by the behavior of light on leaves that the world, at its most essential level, does not hold still, and that this is not a problem but a grace. You breathe. The green air fills you, and the garden invites you deeper. The stairway between the first and second terrace is made of a stone that is not the same as the terrace floor stone. It is a softer stone, limestone perhaps, quarried from somewhere further north and carried down the river on flat-bottomed barges, and its surface has been worn by the passing of many feet into a gentle concavity, each step carrying in its centre the shallow depression of accumulated footsteps, the physical record of all the people who have climbed this particular flight of stairs on their way to the garden above. The concavity is deepest at the centre and shallower at the edges, and this distribution tells you something about how people move when they climb stairs, that they instinctively seek the centre, the most direct path, the line of least psychological resistance, and there is something unexpectedly moving about this anonymous aggregate of preference, this shape made not by any single person but by the accumulated choices of thousands, each one unaware that their passing was being recorded in stone, each one simply going where they needed to go. The handrail along this stairway is cedar wood, thick and smooth, its grain running parallel to the length of the rail so that your hand moves along it with the grain rather than across it. A continuous gentle stroke that releases the faintest breath of cedar scent, warm, dry, slightly sweet, entirely familiar in the way of things that have been significant to human beings for so long that the scent itself has become coded into something deeper than memory. You're halfway up the stairway when the scent reaches you. It is not the cedar. The cedar is behind you now, or beside you, or underfoot in some sense, absorbed into the general background of the stairway's experience. This new scent comes from above. It comes down the stairway to meet you the way warm air comes down from an open door in winter, with the quality of an invitation, with the quality of something that is glad you are coming. It is floral, unmistakably and completely floral, but it is not the simple, singular florality of a single flower in a vase. It is the complex, layered, continuously shifting florality of a large space in which many different flowering species are blooming simultaneously, each one contributing its particular register to a collective olfactory chord that is greater than the sum of its individual notes. The second terrace opens before you as you reach the top of the stairway, and it is everything the scent promised. Roses. They are everywhere, not in the disciplined rows of a formal garden, but in the exuberant, sprawling, slightly anarchic abundance of things that have been given adequate space and adequate water, and have responded to this generosity by expanding in every direction available to them, climbing the terrace walls, trailing over the stone balustrades, massing in dense thickets in the wide central beds, sending individual long-thorned canes arcing up over the path so that walking through this part of the garden requires a certain attentiveness, certain awareness of where the thorns are and where they are not. The roses here are ancient cultivated varieties, their petals deeply cupped, their flowers full and densely packed, their colours running the full warm spectrum from the palest blush pink that is almost white to a red so deep and saturated it reads almost as a dark maroon in the shadow of the leaves, with every shade of rose and salmon and amber and golden yellow distributed between these poles in an arrangement that seems, at first glance, entirely spontaneous, but reveals on closer observation the careful consideration of a gardener who understood colour relationships and knew how to place them for maximum effect. The smell of them is extraordinary. It is not light or delicate. This is not the wisp of fragrance you associate with a cut flower in a cool room. It is dense and full and warm, thickened by the afternoon heat that has been building in this terrace since the morning, concentrated by the enclosing walls and the general windlessness of this slightly sheltered space into something you can almost feel against your face, something with almost a physical weight to it, a warm aromatic pressure that meets you as you step onto the terrace and simply enfolds you without effort, without any sense of imposition, the way a warm room enfolds you when you come in from the cold. Along the near wall, a cascade of jasmine has achieved such density that the wall itself is barely visible beneath it. Only the very top of the parapet shows above the white-starred mass of the jasmine flowers, each individual bloom a small five-pointed star no larger than your smallest fingernail, the whole mass of them together a constellation brought down to ground level, a galaxy of white points against the deep lustrous green of the jasmine leaves. The jasmine's fragrance is different from the roses, lighter and higher in its register, with a sweetness that has a slightly cool, almost green quality to it, as though the scent itself is aware of its own smallness and compensates with an airiness, a volatility, willingness to travel that the heavier rose fragrance does not possess. The jasmine smell follows you as you walk, drifting past you on the intermittent movement of warm air, appearing and fading and appearing again, marking your passage through the terrace with a changing, flickering olfactory accompaniment. Between the rose beds where the paths cross and the stones have been laid in careful herringbone patterns of warm-toned brick, smaller flowering plants fill the lower register of the garden's visual field, beds of herbs that serve both culinary and aromatic purposes, their presence here part of the garden's practical vocabulary as well as its aesthetic one. Broad-leafed basil releases its dark, peppery green fragrance if you brush your hand against it in passing. Hyssop sends up spikes of small purple flowers that the bees are currently working with a focused, methodical thoroughness, each bee moving from flower to flower in a pattern that suggests a very specific, very efficient algorithm, the product of evolutionary refinement far longer in duration than the garden itself. Lavender, if it is lavender, and the scent argues persuasively that it is, rises in narrow columns of grey-green foliage and purple-grey flower spikes along the sunny edge of the terrace, and the bees are working this too. And the combined ambient sound of all these bees moving through all these flowers is a sound that you have, without quite realizing it, been hearing since you entered this terrace. A low, constant, utterly peaceful hum that underlies all the other sounds the way a held note underlies a melody, the stable foundation upon which all the other sensory information of this place rests. The afternoon light on this terrace is different from the light below. Because the terrace is more open, more exposed to the sky, the light here is fuller and more direct, striking the rose petals at a low angle that reveals every fold and gradation of their surface, the slight translucency of the thinner outer petals where the light passes through them and illuminates the veins running through the petal tissue in thin lines of a slightly deeper colour, the rich, almost velvety texture of the innermost petals that have only recently uncurled from the bud and still carry in their tightly folded surface memory the impression of how they were held before they were open. You stop beside a rose that is in the perfect moment of its opening. Not a bud, not fully closed, but not yet fully open either. Caught in the exact middle of the process of becoming, the outer petals already fully unfurled and curving gracefully outward, the inner petals still folded inward in a close private arrangement, the whole flower balanced at that particular point of transformation where it is most completely itself, neither arriving nor departing. You stay there a long moment. The bees move around you. The light is warm. The afternoon asks nothing of you at all. The gardeners of the Hanging Gardens are not a celebrated people. Their names are not inscribed on the walls of the great palace. Their likenesses are not rendered in the glazed blue tiles of the Ishtar Gate, and no scribe has taken particular pains to record their individual histories on the thousands of clay tablets that fill the archive rooms of the palace complex below. They are, in the accounting of this civilization's official memory, background figures, people whose labor is assumed and subsumed into the existence of the thing they labor to maintain, the way the labor of the water is assumed into the existence of the river. But here in the garden itself, at this particular hour of the afternoon, their presence is entirely apparent and entirely human. Then the more you attend to them, the more clearly you see that their work is a form of knowledge as complete and as complex as any possessed by the astronomers in their high tower or the scribes in their archive rooms, a knowledge embedded not in cuneiform marks on clay but in the hands themselves, the body's accumulated understanding of what soil needs and what it does not need, what a root wants and what will discourage it, where the water should go and where it should be withheld. The gardener working the bed nearest to you on this second terrace is a man of perhaps 40 years, his face the colour and texture of old cedar bark, deeply lined in the way that the faces of people who work outdoors acquire their lines, not through worry but through the simple long exposure to light and wind, and the gradual accumulative expressions of attention, of squinting and assessing and considering, off spending a working life in a close and ongoing conversation with growing things. He is wearing a simple linen garment, undyed and somewhat faded to a warm cream colour, belted at the waist with a cord, and his feet are bare in the way that speaks not of poverty but of preference. Off, a person who works intimately with soil and for whom the removal of sandals is not an inconvenience but a professional choice, a decision to maintain direct contact with the medium of the work. His hands are extraordinary. You notice this before you notice almost anything else about him, the hands with their wide, thick-knuckled fingers, their permanently darkened creases, the soil worked so deeply into the halls of his fingerprints that no amount of washing has entirely removed it. Then that has instead become a kind of natural pigment, a continuous low-level staining that maps the topography of his skin in darker tones. These are not merely the hands of someone who works, these are the hands of someone whose work has entered into them, has altered them at the level of their structure, has made them into instruments specifically adapted over decades of use, the way water shapes the channel through which it flows. He is pruning. The tool he is using is a small bronze blade with a curved, hook-shaped cutting edge and a wooden handle worn absolutely smooth, the grain of the wood raised slightly by years of sweat and oil from his palm. And he uses it with a decisiveness that is not rough but precise, each cut made without hesitation, at exactly the right angle, in exactly the right place, the pruned stem falling away cleanly without tearing. He is removing the old growth from a rose cane, cutting back to a node from which new, more vigorous growth will emerge. And as he works, he is entirely concentrated, entirely present, his gaze moving over the cane with an assessment that reads its history in its structure, the way a scholar reads a text, the direction of previous cuts, the sites of old damage healed over in smooth rounded scars, the places where the bark is thick and vigorous versus the places where it has thinned to the amber transparency of something past its best productive years. He does not notice you, or if he does, he incorporates your presence into his awareness without any disruption to his work, the way a person doing something they know very well incorporates all the ambient information of their surroundings without being particularly distracted by any of it. There is a quality of absorption in the way he works that is very like the quality of meditation or of prayer, a focused, singular, completely present attention directed entirely at the task in front of him, all the rest of the world receding to a peripheral hum. Further along the terrace, near the far end where the jasmine wall reaches its greatest density, two younger gardeners are working together on the business of training new growth. They are directing the long, flexible new canes of a climbing rose toward an arrangement of wooden stakes and horizontal crossbars, tying the canes with narrow strips of soft fibre that they tear from a pile of material sitting between them on the path. Each strip long enough to make a figure-eight tie that holds the cane against the stake without cutting into it, that guides without constraining, that suggests direction without imposing it. They work with a running, low-voiced commentary to one another, not about the work exactly, but about other things, the particular domestic details of their lives beyond the garden, the conversation threading between them like the canes between the stakes, continuous and easy and unimportant and deeply quietly companionable. The younger of the two pauses in his work and holds up a cane for the other to see, pointing to something near the base of it, a small cluster of new leaves just emerging from a bud, each leaf still tightly folded, a deep burgundy red in colour before the chlorophyll develops, the leaves themselves the texture of new cloth, slightly shiny, slightly furred, the whole tiny cluster of them so new to the world that they still hold the folded crease memory of how they were before they were open. The older gardener looks at what is being indicated, nods once, says something brief that is approval or confirmation, and they return to their tying. There is a cart near the stairway, a small wooden cart with two wheels and long handles for pushing, that currently holds the morning's accumulated garden waste, pruned rose canes, some brown and dried, some still green and supple at the cut end, dead-headed flowers whose petals have already dried to thin papery fragments in the afternoon heat, weeds pulled root, and all from the soil of the herb beds still holding clods of dark earth around their root systems. The smell of this cart is the smell of the garden's metabolic process of things removed from the living system, so that the energy they were consuming might be redistributed to living growth, the smell of endings that are also in the circular logic of gardening beginnings. At some point during the afternoon, this cart will be wheeled to the composting area at the far end of the lower terrace, and the material in it will be added to the great pile of decomposing organic matter that the gardeners maintain as the garden's slow, dark engine, the place where old growth becomes new soil, where the used and the finished become the potential and the possible, where time does the most fundamental and the most mysterious of all its work. Shadow passes briefly over the terrace, a large bird, a heron perhaps, following the river's course, and then the light returns, tunaltered, warm, and easy. The gardener with the bronze blade clips another stem. The two young men tie another cane. The afternoon continues in its unhurried way. Twice each day, in the early morning before the heat of the sun arrives in earnest, and again in the long, tilting afternoon when the light begins to think about becoming evening, the water carriers make their rounds through the garden. There are 4 of them assigned to the hanging gardens at any given time, and they rotate their duties across the day in a schedule that has been established over so many years of practice that it no longer requires explicit negotiation or reminder. It is simply known, absorbed into the rhythm of each carrier's body the way the movements of a daily routine are absorbed, becoming as automatic and as self-sustaining as breathing. Each carrier is responsible for a particular section of the garden's irrigation system, the cisterns and the secondary channels, and the clay distribution pipes buried beneath the soil of the upper terraces, and each knows their section with an intimacy born of long, attentive repetition, knows where the pipes are prone to silting, where the stone channels have developed small cracks that need monitoring, where the soil of a particular bed is draining too quickly, and where it is holding water too long. The water carrier working the upper section of the second terrace this afternoon is a woman named, by the oldest gardener's informal convention, something approximately translatable as the one who watches the water, a name that is not quite a proper name but functions as one given in recognition of her particular quality of attention to her work, her ability to look at a stretch of channel or a section of soil and know from the evidence available to her eyes exactly what the water is doing and what it needs to be made to do differently. She carries her main implement, a long-handled wooden tool with a flat, slightly angled blade at the end, over her shoulder with the ease of something she has been carrying in some form or another since she was old enough to lift it. Its weight so familiar it has ceased to register as weight and has become simply a part of her body's understood balance. She is currently attending to a section of the main distribution channel where a slow accumulation of soil washed down from the upper bed has begun to reduce the channel's effective depth. It is a small problem, the kind of small problem that left unattended becomes a larger problem with the patient inevitability of all deferred maintenance, and she addresses it with the calm efficiency of someone who has attended to this particular small problem or its equivalent many times before. The flat blade of her tool enters the silted section of the channel at a low angle and removes the accumulated material in neat, clean strokes, depositing it to the side of the path where it will be collected and returned to the beds. The inside of the newly cleared section of channel gleams with the dark wetness of wet stone, and the water, meeting suddenly less resistance, quickens briefly, a small local acceleration in the current, a momentary energy before settling back to its usual contemplative pace. The sound of her work, the regular soft scraping of the tool against the stone, the small liquid sound of displaced water finding its new level, the occasional quiet knock of the wooden handle against the channel edge, becomes another layer in the garden's afternoon acoustic composition, joining the bees and the birds and the more distant sound of the city below. It is a working sound, a productive sound, entirely without urgency or stress, the sound of necessary attention being paid to the everyday requirements of a living system. Near the upper stairway, where the second and third terraces meet, there is a large ceramic storage jar, the kind called a pithos in the later Greek lexicon that will not exist for another few centuries yet, set into a recess in the terrace wall with such care that it fits its recess exactly, the curve of its shoulder just kissing the stone on either side, held in place by its own weight and the precision of its placement. This jar holds the reserve water supply for the upper sections of the second terrace, a buffer against moments when the main delivery from the upper cisterns is reduced or temporarily interrupted, when the morning water distribution has been insufficient for the needs of a particularly thirsty afternoon. The jar is full, you can see the dark line of the water level through the narrow mouth at the top, and its ceramic body is damp on the outside, because good unglazed clay breathes allows a slow and continuous migration of moisture through its wall. Tanned, this evaporation from the surface keeps the water inside measurably cooler than the ambient air. Running your hand across the exterior of the jar, your palm comes away cool and slightly damp, as though you have touched a living thing that breathes through its skin. The water carriers of the garden have a particular walk. It is not quite the walk of someone who is hurrying and not quite the walk of someone who is leisurely. It is something between the two, a measured, even pace that covers ground efficiently without sacrificing the quality of attention necessary to notice what the garden is telling them as they move through it. The eyes of an experienced water carrier are continuously active, scanning the soil surface for evidence of waterlogging or drought stress, checking the channel water levels, noting the condition of the plants along the path in a way that is not botanical or aesthetic, but strictly functional, reading the vegetation as an instrument for reading the water. A leaf curling at its edge means moisture stress. The roots need more. A leaf yellowing from its center outward means the roots have too much. The drainage needs attention. Stem that has flopped rather than standing upright might indicate that the soil is compacting and water is pooling, unable to drain through the ceramic shard layer at the required rate. This constant fluid reading of the garden's hydraulic state is the water carrier's primary expertise, and it is knowledge that exists entirely outside of anything that can be written on a clay tablet or taught in a formal sense. It is transmitted through proximity and time and the accumulated correction of small errors, through the patient experience of watching what happens when you do something one way versus another way, and filing that observation away in the body's archive where it will be available exactly when needed. The afternoon water round takes approximately 1 hour to complete for each carrier's assigned section. When it is finished, the carriers gather briefly at the lower end of the second terrace, near the pithos jar, and exchange the low-voiced reports of their rounds, the silted channel now cleared, a section of the third terrace upper bed showing signs of waterlogging that will need monitoring, the main distribution channel running slightly below its ideal flow rate and probably needing an adjustment to the sluice settings at the upper cistern. This exchange of information is brief and practical and conducted in the shorthand of people who share a common expertise, who can communicate significant technical detail in a few compressed phrases because the underlying framework of understanding is held in common and does not need to be reconstructed in every conversation. After the exchange, they disperse back to their respective sections, back to the ongoing, patient work of making sure the water is exactly where it needs to be. The garden breathes around them, green and content. The afternoon, unhurried, continues to unfold. There is a corner of the uppermost inhabited terrace of the Hanging Gardens, the third terrace, shielded on its northern face by a low stone wall that is covered from base to parapet in a thick tapestry of Mediterranean time, where the hum of bees is so constant and so complete that it ceases to be perceived as sound after a few minutes of standing within it and becomes instead a kind of atmospheric quality, like the warmth of the afternoon or the green of the light through leaves. The hives are kept here, 4 of them, built in the old Babylonian style from coiled lengths of baked clay pipe, sealed at both ends with flat clay caps, their outer surfaces rough with the texture of the coiling, each hive oriented with its entrance hole facing east to catch the morning sun and warm the colony for its first foraging sorties of the day. The hives have been positioned against the time wall with clear deliberation, set at approximately waist height on a platform of flat stones, accessible to the beekeeper without requiring uncomfortable crouching or reaching, the positioning of each hive allowing the bees to fly out directly into the open space of the terrace without obstruction. In front of the hives, the stone platform is dark with the accumulated landing marks of thousands of returning bees, each one arriving with legs packed with pollen, orange, yellow, white, pale green, deep ochre, the colours of the flowers of the garden distributed and concentrated into these small carried loads of the hive's essential supply. The beekeeper is a small, compact person of indeterminate age who moves among the hives with the particular combination of complete calm and complete attention that is the hallmark of someone who works with creatures that can sting. The movements are slow, not tentative, not cautious in the way of someone who is afraid, but slow in the way of someone who has learned through long experience that slowness is the language bees understand best, that the bees experience sudden movement as threat in a way they do not experience gradual movement, and that the entire negotiation between human and bee, worked out over this long professional acquaintance, rests on this understanding. Slow hands, slow head turns, slow steps. The beekeeper moves through the hive area as though time is running at a slightly different rate here. as though the beekeeper exists in a slightly gentler, more dilated version of the afternoon. There is no smoke being used at this visit. Smoke from a small clay smudge pot burning dried herbs and damp reed is the beekeeper's tool for calm inspections, for moments when the hives need to be opened and the combs examined. But this afternoon's visit is not an inspection. The beekeeper is here simply to observe, to listen, to read the external behavior of the hives and assess from it the internal state of the colonies. This external reading is its own deep skill, a fluency in the behavioral language of bees, an understanding of what the clustering patterns at the entrance hole mean, what the flight trajectories of returning workers indicate about where the foraging is currently happening, what the particular quality of the hive's audible hum conveys about the colony's mood and energy level. A returning bee lands on the platform directly in front of the middle hive, and the beekeeper's gaze follows it with quiet interest. The bee's hind leg baskets, the corbiculae, those elegant hollow structures on the outer surface of the bee's hind tibia, into which the bee packs its collected pollen using the combs of its middle legs, are packed with pollen of a deep saturated orange that the beekeeper identifies with the casual expertise of long familiarity as coming from the marigolds in the bed along the eastern end of the second terrace. The marigolds are in full bloom this week, and the bees have been working them heavily, attracted by the richness of both pollen and nectar, and the honey being made in the combs right now will carry in it, when it is finally extracted, a faint quality of the marigold's warm, slightly resinous sweetness. Honey from the garden hives is different from honey made anywhere else. This is not a claim made for the sake of sentiment, it is a verifiable, perceptible difference that anyone who has tasted garden honey and compared it to honey made from the wildflower meadows of the plain will confirm without hesitation. The reason is the extraordinary concentration and diversity of the pollen sources available to these particular bees, who work a garden specifically designed to maintain flowering species across the entire growing season, providing a continuous and varied buffet of pollen and nectar types that no single wild environment could match. The honey made in these hives carries in its flavour the entire aromatic vocabulary of the hanging gardens: rose and jasmine and thyme and hyssop and lavender, the dark sweetness of date palm nectar, the subtle resinous quality of herbs in the warm afternoon, the honeyed depths of pomegranate blossom, all of it dissolved and transformed in the bodies of 10,000 bees and deposited in the wax cells of the comb in a form that is, in some real and tasting sense, the garden itself in liquid form, the garden made edible, made portable, made possible to carry away and remember. The beekeeper reaches very slowly into a small clay container held in the crook of one arm and withdraws a piece of comb, honeycomb, the capped wax cells intact, the honey sealed inside by thin wax caps that are slightly darker than the surrounding comb wax. The caps puffed slightly outward with the pressure of the honey behind them. This is a piece set aside from last week's extraction, a piece being kept back not for consumption but for examination, for the beekeeper's own ongoing study of the relationship between the garden's seasonal progression and the character of the honey made at different points of the season. The beekeeper holds the comb up against the afternoon light, and the light passes through the wax walls of the cells with a warm amber translucency, illuminating the honey trapped inside with a glow that makes the comb look, for a moment, like a very small stained glass window, each cell its own intimate lantern. The honey varies in colour across the piece of comb, lighter in some cells, deeper in others, evidence of different pollen types stored in different areas, the bee's own organisational logic expressed in a visible colour spectrum that runs from pale gold to deep amber brown. The beekeeper puts the comb back in the clay container. The bees move in their continuous purposeful arcs around the hive entrances, arriving and departing with the metronomic regularity of something that does not take rest in the middle of the day, that does not pause to appreciate the quality of the afternoon light or notice the smell of the garden it is working, but simply continues, continuously, the ancient and essential work of collecting and storing and making. And the hum of all of them together fills the corner of the terrace like warm water fills a vessel, completely, gently, leaving no space empty. You lean against the time wall. You close your eyes very briefly. The hum of the bees enters you like a sound that has always been there, just beneath the threshold of your noticing. On the covered terrace at the garden's western edge, where a shallow roof of cedar beams and reed matting creates a shaded space that is more interior than the open terraces, yet more connected to the garden than any room inside the palace walls, there is a table made of thick cedar planks set on stone legs, and at this table, in the late afternoon, a scribe works. His name is something the records of his civilization would write in wedge marks pressed into clay, but the shape and sound of it, to your ear, might come approximately to something like Enasir, a name invoking the god Ea, Lord of Wisdom and Water, which seems appropriate for a man who has devoted his life to the art of preserving the accumulated knowledge of a civilization in the only medium available to him for the purpose: clay. Soft, wet, patient clay pressed between the hands, smoothed to a working surface, then impressed with the triangular tip of a stylus cut from reed, the wedge-shaped marks building into a language that is visual but also deeply tactile, language that exists equally in the eye that reads it and the hand that makes it. He is working at this particular hour of the afternoon on a record that concerns the garden itself, a regular inventory and status report that is made monthly and filed in the palace archive, a document recording the current condition of each terrace's plantings, the state of the water delivery systems, the health of the hive colonies, the names of the head gardeners, the quantities of materials consumed and materials needed. It is administrative, functional documentation, unpoetic in its intentions, but it is through exactly this kind of document, this kind of careful, routine accounting of the ordinary, that the most durable knowledge of an ancient civilization is preserved, more reliably than through the grand commemorative inscriptions on temple walls, because this kind of document was made to be used, not displayed, and its survival depends not on the material quality of the artifact, but on the simple fact of its accumulation, the way sand accumulates on a riverbank. The clay tablet he is working on is approximately the size of a palm, slightly rounded at the edges from the shaping of his hands, and it sits in his left hand while his right hand holds the stylus, length of reed cut to a precise angle at its working end and worn on the upper surface by the grip of his fingers to a smoothness that has darkened the reed to a deep golden brown. The clay is at the right stage of damp, not too wet, which causes the marks to blur and close together, and not too dry, which causes the surface to resist the stylus and require more pressure than allows for fine control. And the marks he is making have the clean, precise edges of work done at the optimal moment, each wedge impression sharp at its entry point and tapering cleanly to its end. The sound of this work is very small. The stylus entering the clay makes a sound approximately like the sound of the minute hand of a very sensitive clock, a tiny, precise, almost inaudible registration that you can only hear if you're very close, and the ambient sound is very still. And the afternoon is, at this particular end of the terrace, relatively still. The breeze does not quite reach this corner, held back by the overhanging cedar roof, and the nearest active beehive is far enough away that its hum arrives here as a mere trace, a suggestion rather than a presence. So the small sound of the stylus in the clay is the loudest thing in this space, which makes it, paradoxically, a deeply quiet sound, the sound of absolute concentration meeting its medium in perfect conditions. Beside the main working tablet, Ionacer has arranged the materials of his work in an order that reflects long practice. A small clay cup of water for moistening his fingertip when he needs to smooth a section of the tablet surface before reusing it, piece of flat stone for resting the completed tablets on while they achieve their first stage of drying, a bundle of spare reed styli in different sizes bound together with a strip of palm fibre, small lump of the same clay as the tablet for making quick test impressions when he needs to assess his stylus angle, and slightly apart from the working materials, a stack of 3 completed tablets from the previous monthly reports, their clay now fully dried and hardened to a pale ochre colour, their surface marks fixed permanently in the material the way memories become fixed in the longer-term structures of the mind. He is currently recording a section that concerns the pomegranate trees of the first terrace, their current fruiting status, a note about minor insect damage to 2 of the younger trees requiring treatment with a mixture of ash and oil, the expected harvest quantity for the coming month and the intended distribution of that harvest between the palace kitchens and the daily offerings to the temple. This is not grand information. It is the accounting of an afternoon's worth of a senior gardener's attention to two slightly troubled trees in one small corner of a very large garden, but it will be recorded with the same care, in the same medium, using the same formal conventions as a royal decree or a astronomical observation or a religious hymn, because this civilization understands with a clarity that later civilizations will struggle to maintain, that all knowledge is worth preserving, that the record of small practical things is as necessary to the continuity of civilization as the record of great and glorious things, and that a civilization that only remembers its triumphs has lost the knowledge of how it actually lived. The afternoon light, entering the covered terrace at a low angle from the west, falls across the surface of Eanasir's working tablet and illuminates the freshly impressed marks from the side, throwing each wedge impression into a small, clear relief of shadow that makes the cuneiform script suddenly completely three-dimensional. Not marks on a flat surface, but small physical events, small topographic features, a landscape of meaning pressed into earth. He pauses, reads back over what he has written, checks it against the notes he has made on a small rough-edged preliminary tablet beside him, makes a correction, the stylus smoothing over a slightly misplaced sign and reimposing it with greater care, then continues. Somewhere below the garden, the city temple bell is struck once, marking a division of the afternoon. Eanasir does not look up. He has several more tablets to complete before the light fails. His hand moves. The stylus enters the clay. The small sound is made. The record grows, patiently, tone wedge mark at a time. There is a section of the third terrace tucked into the north-facing corner where the terrace wall turns at a right angle and the direct afternoon sun does not reach. That is devoted to a category of cultivation distinct from the ornamental and the simply agricultural category that sits at the intersection of the practical and the sacred, the empirical and the devotional. This is the herb garden of the healers. It is not large, perhaps 15 paces along its longer side and 10 along its shorter, but it is extraordinarily dense with intention. Every square cubit of its growing surface occupied by something useful, something medicinal or protective or spiritually significant, the plants arranged not by the aesthetic logic of colour and height that governs the flower terraces, but by the practical logic of use, of affinity, off the ancient and deeply felt belief that certain plants exist in relationship with certain parts of the human body or certain conditions of the human spirit, and that the knowledge of these relationships, this knowledge that has been accumulated over generations of careful observation and is held in the memory of the healers and the pages of the medical texts that occupy their own section of the palace archive, is among the most precious knowledge that any civilization can possess. The smell of this corner is different from the rest of the garden. Where the flower terraces smell of sweetness and florality, this corner smells of something more complex and more medicinal, an earthy, resinous, slightly sharp quality that is not unpleasant but is certainly not merely decorative. Wormwood grows here in silver-green mounds, its artemisia scent rising sharp and clean and slightly bitter when you brush against it. A scent that has been used for generations in this part of the world to drive away insects that carry disease, to treat intestinal parasites, purify enclosed spaces where illness has been present. Beside it myrtle, its small pointed leaves dark and glossy, intensely aromatic when pressed between the fingers, releasing an oil whose scent is somewhere between eucalyptus and pepper and has been valued in this civilization as an antiseptic and a treatment for respiratory complaints. Along the back wall of this corner, in the deepest shade, grow the plants that require the most careful handling and the most respectful attention, not because they are dangerous in themselves precisely, but because they are powerful, and in the medical understanding of this time and place, power in the plant world is a quality that exists on a continuum between the healing and the harmful, and the difference between medicine and something else entirely often comes down to a question of quantity and method and knowledge. Mandrake grows here, its broad, dark, slightly unpleasant-smelling leaves rosetting out from a central point at soil level, its root descending deep and forked into the earth in the famous shape that will, much later, make it the subject of so many stories and superstitions. The healer who tends this garden has marked the mandrake with a small flat stone placed precisely at the centre of each plant's rosette, not so much as a warning as a reminder to the self and to any apprentice who works in this corner that this particular plant demands a quality of attention slightly different from the attention given to the wormwood or the myrtle. The healer herself comes to this garden in the morning and again in the late afternoon, the same hours as the water carriers, which is not a coincidence but a convergence of the same logic, the understanding that these are the hours when the garden is most receptive to human attention, when the temperature is appropriate for the work and the light is sufficient for the close observation that the work requires. She is a person whose authority in the palace is informal but absolute in its own domain, not the authority of rank or hereditary position, but the authority of knowledge, of being the person who knows how to move between the world of the well and the world of the ill, and to carry with them, their hands and in their memory, the means of restoration. This afternoon she is harvesting. The tool she uses for most harvesting is a small curved bronze knife, its blade kept very sharp, sharper than the pruning knives of the gardeners, sharper than the kitchen knives of the palace cooks, because the cut made in harvesting medicinal plants matters in ways that kitchen cuts do not, because a clean cut at the right point in the right season is itself a part of the medicine. A respectful incision that takes what is needed without damaging what remains, leaving the plant capable of its own recovery and its own continued offering. She is cutting bunches of hyssop, the small purple-flowered herb whose narrow grey-green leaves contain an oil valued for its effects on the respiratory passages, used in the treatment of coughs and chest tightness and the congestion that comes with seasonal illness. The bunches she cuts are each the size that can be held in one hand, the stems gathered at the base and tied with a few twists of plant fibre before being placed in a wide, shallow basket that she carries over her arm. She will hang these bunches from the cedar beams of the drawing room in the palace basement, where the warmth and the air circulation will dry them over the course of a week to the state where the volatile oils are concentrated and stabilized, where the color has deepened from fresh green-gray to a more muted dusty silver, where the smell has intensified and changed slightly to something more penetrating and more lasting. Across the center of the herb garden, a low stone bench has been placed and then worn by long use to a smoothness that makes it clear it has been here as long as anything else in this corner, placed as a working surface, as a place to sit while examining the plants, as a place to lay out materials for the preparation of compounds and remedies in the early morning before the day's patients arrive. On the bench right now there is a clay mortar well used, its inner surface stained by the accumulated residue of years of grinding dried herbs into powder, each stain a different shade of grey-green or ochre or dark brown, the collective record of many remedies made in this vessel over this vessel's long useful life. The pestle beside it is heavy, rounded, worn into a perfect ergonomic fit with the hand that uses it most often. The afternoon light reaches down into this corner at its own low angle, and the silver leaves of the wormwood catch it and return it as a pale, almost luminous shimmer. Somewhere in the city below, someone who will sleep better tonight because of something made in this corner of the garden is going about their afternoon unaware of this future kindness. The healer cuts another bunch of hyssop. The smell rises, sharp and clean and good. In the kitchens of the palace complex below the garden, the great vaulted rooms of the ground floor where the cooking fires burn from before dawn to after dark, their smoke rising through the gaps in the cedar roof to join the general atmospheric conversation of the city's smoke overhead. The preparations for the evening meal have been underway since the middle of the afternoon. But the kitchen's influence reaches the garden long before any food does. It arrives first as smell, the first intimation of cooking fire, the warm, slightly sweet exhalation of cedar and acacia wood burning at the proper temperature for bread baking, which is a different and more specific smell than the general cedar smoke smell of the city, is a smell that has in it the promise of something imminent and nourishing, something in the process of becoming ready. This smell floats up through the warm afternoon air from the kitchen vents below and drifts through the lower levels of the garden, adding itself to the existing scent vocabulary of the terrace in a new register, the domestic, the culinary, the warmly human register that smells of care and provision and the simple, ongoing human project of feeding the body at the end of each particular day. The bread at the palace kitchens is baked in large domed clay ovens whose inner surfaces over years of use have been seasoned by accumulated heatings and coolings to a state of ideal smoothness, every residual crack in the original clay long since healed over by the slow work of thermal cycling. The interior surface of the oven now a continuous, even medium for heat distribution that ensures the bread placed against it browns evenly, reliably, with the same slightly burnished, slightly blistered quality every time. The bread itself is a flatbread, made from emmer wheat flour that has been ground in the mill attached to the palace's grain stores, and then mixed with water and a small amount of salt, and left to develop in large clay bowls through the middle hours of the afternoon. By this particular afternoon hour, when the light has begun its long descent from its meridian brightness toward the warmer, longer shadowed quality of early evening, the dough has been in its final resting stage for about an hour, and the bakers are beginning the shaping. The shape is a simple disc, stretched and flattened with the heels of the hands rather than rolled, because hand shaping leaves a texture in the dough that the rolling pin does not, small irregularities, slight variations in thickness, places where the dough is marginally thicker and will rise a fraction more in the oven, places where it is thinner and will crisp more readily, creating in the finished bread a surface topography of tiny hills and valleys that holds flavors differently in different places, that makes the bread more interesting to eat than a perfectly uniform bread would be. The smell of the baking bread when the first shaped rounds are placed against the hot interior of the oven and the door is sealed, is a smell that reaches the garden with a particular directness, as though this specific smell has a particular urgency or priority in the hierarchy of smells. Smell, whose evolutionary significance to human beings is so deeply coded that it bypasses the usual processing of scent information and arrives directly at something like comfort, like reassurance, like the specific and wordless feeling of knowing that things are being taken care of, that the day's needs will be met, that there is food coming. You notice it from the upper terrace, where you have been sitting on a low stone bench watching the afternoon gradually change its quality of light. The smell arrives quite suddenly, or not quite suddenly, but with enough distinction from the background that it registers as an event rather than a gradual change, and something in you responds to it before you have consciously identified what it is: a slight easing, a small instinctive settling. The bread. On the terrace with you, one of the younger gardeners, finished with the afternoon tying of the rose canes, sitting now on the steps between the second and third terrace, with his legs stretched out and his back against the warm stone, lifts his head slightly when the smell reaches him and makes a brief sound of satisfaction, a sound that requires no translation. He tips his head back against the stone and closes his eyes, and you can see in the line of his body the particular relaxation of someone who has been working physically all day and is now at last beginning to transition toward rest. Further along the terrace, the beekeeper is making one final slow round of the hive entrances before closing down the work of the afternoon. The behaviour of the returning bees at this hour telling a different story from the mid-afternoon rush of heavy foraging, a calmer story of colonies reducing their activity in correspondence with the reducing light, the forager bees making their last trips back with diminishing loads, the guard bees at the entrance holes a little less vigilant, little more settled into the particular quiescence that beehives achieve as evening approaches, as though the entire collective organism of the hive is taking one long, slow, synchronized breath. The light on the garden now is the light of early evening. It has a horizontal quality that the midday light does not have, arriving at an angle that is low enough to illuminate the undersides of leaves, to catch the small hairs on the stems of herbs and turn them briefly luminous, make the water in the open channels catch fire for a few minutes in a way that is entirely disproportionate to the modest amount of water actually present. The stone of the terrace walls takes on a deep, warm amber in this light, the same warm amber as new honey, as the inner wood of cedar freshly cut, as the fur of a tawny cat sleeping in the sun, a colour that is the colour of warmth itself made visible. The roses, this light, become something extraordinary. The deep red varieties, which in the cooler, more neutral light of morning read as simply red, become in this long, warm, angling evening light a colour that is almost beyond description, a deep, luminous, almost liquid red that seems lit from within, that seems to have absorbed the entire quality of the afternoon and be releasing it now in a colour so saturated and so warm that looking at it feels less like seeing and more like being briefly, gently enveloped by a feeling that does not have a name but is entirely positive in its effect. The smell of bread continues to rise from below. The bees have all gone home. The garden settles into its evening self. He comes to the garden in the hour before the stars appear. He comes from the great observation tower on the northern side of the city, from the high platform at its summit where he has spent the greater part of this afternoon sitting with a clay tablet on his knee, recording the position of Venus against the background of fixed stars with the same methodical, unhurried precision that Ionisir applies to his administrative records and the head gardener applies to the training of rose canes. He is perhaps 60 years old, an age that in this city at this time speaks of either exceptional fortune or exceptional constitution, and the long years of his practice have given his face a quality of settled attention, quality of being permanently oriented towards something vast and slow-moving and magnificent, which, of course, he is. His name has been written on the tablets, but what matters about him here, in this garden at this particular evening hour, is not his name but his practice. The habit he has maintained for years of coming to the garden in this specific transitional hour between afternoon and night, not to observe, the garden is not an observation point, the horizon is interrupted by walls and trees, but to think, to allow the accumulated data of the day's observation to settle into the larger conceptual framework within which it will eventually find its meaning. Because astronomy in Babylon is not merely the recording of where celestial bodies appear in the sky on a given night. It is the patient, multi-generational project of discovering the laws that govern those appearances, the periods of recurrence, the relationships between different bodies' movements, the way the position of Venus on a particular night can be predicted from the position of Venus on a corresponding night in a previous cycle, if the cycle has been correctly identified, and the identification of the cycle requires data, decades of data, centuries of data accumulated on thousands of clay tablets by dozens of astronomers working across the span of generations, each one adding their observations to the archive that the next generation will use as the basis for refining the model, for testing the prediction against the sky, for noting the discrepancies and understanding what they mean. The astronomer sits on the stone bench in the herb garden's quiet corner. The healer has gone now. The corner is empty except for him and the low hum of insects, and opens his fresh tablet across his knee. He has not come to record tonight's observations. Tonight has not happened yet. He has come to think about a pattern he noticed this morning while reviewing the records of the last 20 years of Venus observations, a small but persistent discrepancy between the predicted position and the observed position that has been occurring at one specific point in Venus's cycle, which means that either the model is slightly wrong or there is something about Venus's motion at that specific point in its cycle that the current model does not account for. He turns this problem over in his mind the way the gardener turns a pruning problem over, looking at it from different sides, applying different aspects of his knowledge to it, testing it against what he already understands. The garden's smell and sound and the cooling evening air register around him not as distractions but as the ambient medium in which thinking happens, the sensory background against which the foreground of the mind's work is conducted, the smell of the drying hyssop bunches left hanging on the near wall, the last note of a bird somewhere in the upper terrace canopy, the faint sound of the channels still running their evening water. He writes something on the tablet, 3 lines of cuneiform compressed, the shorthand of a specialist working in their own field, a notation whose full meaning would require a colleague of equivalent expertise to decode. He reads it back, modifies one sign, reads it again, sets the tablet on the bench beside him and looks up at the sky above the garden, which is still the deep, luminous blue of very late afternoon before the first stars. The sky at this hour, seen from the garden, is framed by the upper edges of the terrace walls and the crowns of the tall trees at the garden's perimeter, and this framing gives it a particular quality. It is a piece of sky rather than the whole sky, window onto the vast rather than the vast itself, and this framing paradoxically increases rather than decreases the intensity of your engagement with it, the way a frame increases your engagement with a painting, the way the contained makes the infinite more accessible to the limited instrument of human attention. The blue deepens very gradually as the sun continues its arc below the western horizon that you cannot see from here. The transition from afternoon blue to evening blue is, when you watch it carefully, not a single smooth gradation, but a sequence of subtly distinct stages, each one slightly different in its hue and its quality, the way the different notes of a scale are distinct stages in a larger musical movement. The deepest blue appears directly overhead, where the atmospheric scattering of the last sunlight is least. The western edge of sky, beyond the garden wall, still holds a faint warmth, a residual trace of orange that is being pressed upward and eastward by the advancing dark. The astronomer watches this transition with the eyes of someone for whom sky watching is not recreational but professional. And this professional attention does not diminish the beauty of what he sees. If anything, it intensifies it. The way, knowing the mechanism of something beautiful can intensify rather than reduce your appreciation of it, can add to the aesthetic response the additional pleasure of understanding, of recognizing the deep, elegant logic running beneath the beautiful surface. The first star appears. It is not quite the first star. It is the first star visible to the eye at ground level, given the current atmospheric conditions and the residual light. The astronomer's eyes find it without searching, because he knows exactly where it will be at exactly this hour of this time of year, knows it the way a musician knows where the next note falls, not from conscious calculation but from the embodied knowledge of long repeated practice. He marks it on the tablet. Then he leans back slightly against the warm stone of the herb garden wall and allows himself, for just a few minutes in this gap between the recorded and the recording, between the day's data and the night's observation, simply to be here in this garden, this particular and unrepeatable crossing of the afternoon and the night, with the smell of hyssop above him and the sound of the channels below and the stars arriving, one by one, with the patient punctuality of things that do not know they are being watched but proceed in their appointed paths regardless. The garden holds him quietly. The stars continue to arrive, and the night, with all its vast and ancient patience, begins. Consider, for a moment, what it means to call something a wonder of the world. The word wonder is a word with many rooms in it. There is wonder as astonishment, the cognitive event that happens when something exceeds the expected, when the world presents a fact that does not fit the model you have been carrying around of what the world can do, and the model must be revised or expanded to accommodate the new information. There is wonder as reverence, the feeling that arises in the presence of something so much larger or more complex or more beautiful than yourself that the ego briefly loses its insistence on remaining central, and for a moment you are simply an attending witness, open and quiet. Then the presence of something that exceeds you in a way that feels more like a gift than an imposition, and there is wonder as question. The form of wonder that does not close on itself in satisfaction but opens outward into inquiry, into the desire to understand the how and the why of the astonishing thing, to pull back the beautiful surface and find the beautiful mechanism beneath it. The hanging gardens inspire all three. The astonishment comes first, and it comes hard, because this garden exists in defiance of the geography that surrounds it. You stand in a city built on a flat alluvial plain where the highest natural feature for miles in any direction is the slight elevation of a river levee, and you look at a garden that rises in terraces to a height that puts its upper levels among the clouds on certain mornings, that supports the root systems of trees that would be large by any standard in their natural environment. And the plain fact of its existence is a statement about human aspiration and human capability so direct and so physical that it requires no translation. Someone looked at the flat plain and decided that flatness was a condition, not a constraint. Someone decided that water, which in this landscape flowed only one direction, could be persuaded to go the other way if you applied sufficient ingenuity and sufficient labour to the problem of persuading it. The reverence comes when you have been in the garden long enough for the initial astonishment to subside and the deeper qualities of the place to become apparent. When you have sat in the shade of the first terrace's great fig tree and felt the quality of the silence there, silence made not of absence but of layered soft sound, when you have walked beside the water channels and felt the cool exhalation of the moving water, modifying the temperature of the air around you, when you have watched the beekeeper at the hives and understood that the honey being made here carries in it, in some literal chemical sense, the accumulated aromatic history of this particular garden. In the reverence stage, the garden is no longer an engineering achievement first and a garden second. It is simply a garden, the most garden-like thing you have ever been in, and the engineering is simply the quiet, invisible, completely essential infrastructure of its being, the way the heart is the infrastructure of the breathing body. The wanderer's question arrives in the evening, perhaps as the astronomer arrives in the herb garden with his tablet and his problem about the slight discrepancy in the Venus records, because this garden, this achievement, prompts the same category of question that the astronomer's discrepancy prompts. How? How was this decided, and who decided it? What conversations happened in what rooms between what people before the first stone of the first terrace foundation was laid? What calculations were made in what system of mathematics, by what minds, to determine how deep the soil layers needed to be to support the weight of trees, how wide the channels needed to be to carry sufficient water to all parts of the structure, how high the terrace walls needed to be to ensure that a person standing on the upper level was experiencing a different world from a person standing on the lower level. And more privately, more quietly, what did it feel like to the person who designed this, to see the first planted terrace take on its first bloom? to see the first tree reach the height of the first terrace wall and then exceed it, its crown rising above the stone into open air, roots finding their way through the pottery drainage layer and anchoring themselves in the deep soil with the confidence of something that has found exactly the right place and intends to stay. What is the experience of making something that is both completely deliberate, every dimension considered, every material chosen, every water flow rate calculated, and completely alive, growing in directions and at rates and in arrangements that no calculation can entirely predict? Because life does not follow engineering schematics with perfect fidelity, but improvises constantly within the parameters of its environment. The builders of this garden understood something that many civilizations before and after have had to learn and relearn, that the most durable things are not the things built most rigidly, but the things built with enough intelligence and flexibility to accommodate the life that will happen within them. The garden is not merely a structure. The garden is a relationship, a continuous, active, daily relationship between the human systems that maintain it and the biological systems that inhabit it, a relationship that requires constant renegotiation, constant responsiveness, constant willingness to notice what the plants are telling you and respond to it rather than simply insisting on the original plan. The gardeners understand this, the water carriers understand it, the beekeeper understands it deeply. This perhaps is the deepest wonder of the hanging gardens, not that they were built, although that is wonderful enough, but that they have been maintained. That the daily, unglamorous, physically demanding work of tending the water channels and pruning the old growth and watching the beekeeper manage the hives has continued, day after day, season after season, year after year, in the service of something that could not survive even a brief interruption of care. The garden is a living argument for the value of sustained attention, for the idea that the most beautiful things in the world require not a single act of genius, but an ongoing commitment to all the small, undramatic acts of maintenance that allow genius to remain alive. You sit on the bench in the herb garden corner, where the astronomer sat earlier, and the warmth of the stone which has been accumulating the day's heat since morning enters you through the back of your thighs and the palms of your hands, a dry, steady, deeply comfortable warmth that is the warmth of a stone that has been loved by the sun all day. The stars are more numerous now. The garden is quieter, and the wonder settles into you slowly, like warmth, like water finding its level, like something you have always known returning to you after a long absence. There is a thought that arrives in gardens, particularly in very old gardens, particularly in gardens that have been tended by many hands across many years, a thought that is not quite melancholy and not quite joy, but occupies the quiet open territory between the two. Thought about the relationship between the living and the no longer living, between the present moment and all the present moments that preceded it in this same place, and are now simply the accumulated depth of the past beneath your feet. The hanging gardens of Babylon will not last forever. This is not a pessimistic statement, it is a factual one, and it is also, if you attend to it carefully, a kind of liberation, because the knowledge that the garden will not last forever is the same knowledge that makes the garden precious right now, in this particular afternoon, with its particular quality of light and its particular temperature of water in the channels, and its particular arrangement of bees working the late flowers. Without the knowledge of impermanence, there is no appreciation of the present. Without the awareness that this will someday be gone, there is no full sense of the extraordinary good fortune of being here now, while it is still here, while the water still flows and the jasmine still releases its evening sweetness, and the stone of the bench still holds the warmth of the afternoon. The Euphrates, upon which this garden ultimately depends, upon whose water, lifted by the patient rotation of oxen and the engineering of channels and cisterns, the entire living system rests, has been shifting its course, very slowly, for centuries already. Rivers in alluvial plains are not fixed entities. They are continuous processes of erosion and deposition, of cut bank and point bar, of meander amplification and meander cut-off, of the slow, inexorable redistribution of sediment that makes the geography of a flat plain a thing in motion, thing whose apparent stability is the stability of a very slow change rather than the stability of stillness. Geographers and engineers of later centuries will watch the Euphrates move away from the ruins of Babylon with the same patient inevitability with which it once flowed beside its walls. Then the progressive reduction of water available to the city's systems will be one of the many causes, operating slowly, simultaneously over the span of generations of the city's eventual decline. But that is not this afternoon. Right now, in this afternoon, the river runs full and the water rises through the hive shafts and flows along the channels, and the roots of the pomegranate trees drink from it, and the bees collect nectar from flowers that could not be here without it. And the garden is as alive and as complete and as present as it has ever been or will be. There is a long tradition in the spiritual and philosophical life of ancient Mesopotamia of meditating on this exact tension, on the gap between the permanence of what we build and the impermanence of the conditions that make building possible, between the stone of the terrace walls and the water that the walls were built to contain and elevate, between the human aspiration toward permanence and the uncooperative nature of time. The great epic of Gilgamesh, which has been written down on clay tablets and exists in the archive rooms of the palace library, in a version that will later be recognized as one of the earliest works of literature in the human record, meditates on this very tension with an emotional intelligence and a philosophical honesty that make it recognizable and resonant to readers across every subsequent century, right up to the moment of your own reading of it, in whatever form you encountered it. Its hero builds walls for Uruk that he hopes will outlast him. That will be the physical evidence of his greatness against the certainty of his own ending. The walls of Uruk, like the terrace walls of this garden, are the human answer to impermanence, the insistence that even if we cannot last, what we make might, and that this is enough, or must be treated as enough, because it is all we have. But the gardens, specifically, introduce a complication to this answer. Because a garden cannot outlast its gardeners. A wall can outlast the wall builders, a written text can outlast its scribe, a clay tablet can be found in the earth 2,000 years after it was impressed and read and understood. But a garden requires its gardeners the way a fire requires its fuel, not in the past, not as a historical condition, but now, continuously, every day without interruption. The day the water carriers stop coming, the time begins to dry. The day the gardeners stop pruning, the old wood chokes the new. The day the beekeeper stops tending the hives, the colonies may thrive for a while on their own. Bees are robust. But the careful management of swarm season and honey harvest that produces the extraordinary garden honey will dissolve back into wild behavior, into the uncurated richness of an unmanaged hive. The garden is, in this specific sense, the most honest of all human constructions about its own nature. It cannot pretend to permanence. Every day of its existence is a daily renewed act of will, a daily reassertion of the intention to maintain, daily refusal of the entropy that waits with absolute patience at the garden's perimeter, and would flow inward without effort the moment the human attention that holds it at bay is withdrawn. And this perhaps is what makes gardens the most completely human of all human creations, not because they represent our mastery of nature, but because they represent our ongoing, never finalized, always renewed relationship with it. The garden does not submit to the gardener. The garden does not yield to the intention of the designer and stay yielded. It grows always in directions it was not entirely expected to grow. It receives the water and the pruning and the attention and responds to them, but responds according to its own nature, not entirely according to human plan. And the successful garden, the garden that achieves something recognizable as beauty, as abundance, as the sense of a living world more complete and more various than any purely human world could be, is the result of a long negotiation between human intention and biological reality. Negotiation that never ends and cannot end and would not be a garden if it did. The stone bench is warm beneath you. The evening stars are arriving in their appointed places. The astronomer, somewhere in the city, pressing their arrival into clay. And the garden, indifferent to its own future impermanence, continues to be completely, vigorously, fragrant and rustling and alive in the only moment it has ever had or ever will have. This one. right now. This evening, settling softly over ancient Babylon like a cloth laid gently over sleeping things, there is a story told about the origin of this garden. It is the kind of story that civilizations generate around their most beautiful things, a story that is probably more truth than fact, more emotionally accurate than historically verifiable, a story that matters not because it can be proven true, but because it tells the compressed and resonant language of story, something true about the human needs that the garden was made to answer. The story says that Nebuchadnezzar II, the great king, the builder of Babylon's golden age, the man whose name is pressed into many of the bricks of the very walls you walked through this afternoon, built this garden for his wife Ametis of Media. Ametis, the story says, was a princess from the mountainous regions of the Persian highlands, from a place of forests and rivers, and the particular quality of cool, verdant air that belongs to places where altitude and moisture have collaborated to produce a landscape entirely unlike the hot, flat, dust-hazed plain of Babylon. She had grown up among mountains. She had grown up with the smell of pine forests and wildflower meadows and streams that ran clear and cold over rocks made colourful by long water exposure. She had grown up in a place where green was not a luxury or an achievement, but simply the default condition of the world, everywhere present, everywhere assumed. And then she came to Babylon. The transition was not merely geographical. It was not merely a matter of different architecture or different food or a different language at court. It was a transition between two entirely different sensory worlds, between a world defined by verticality and greenness and the sound of moving water in its natural channels and the smell of earth damp with rainfall, and a world defined by horizontality and ochre and the smell of river mud and baked brick and cedar smoke. Both worlds have their own beauty. But the body's first world, the landscape of one's earliest sensory formation, establishes a set of expectations about what the world should feel like, smell like, sound like, that persists, quietly, persistently, without much drama, throughout a life lived in a different landscape. The new landscape is never quite as viscerally right as the first. There is always at the body's level a faint sense of discrepancy, a slight mismatch between what the sensory systems expect and what they find. A subtle homesickness that is not grief, not illness, not even consciously experienced most of the time, but is simply there, the way the awareness of something absent is there, noticeable mostly in the moments when something briefly, unexpectedly fills it. The king, the story says, noticed this in his wife. And because he was a man capable of enormous ambition, and because he was, at whatever level great powerful men allow themselves to be genuinely moved by the needs of those close to them, genuinely moved by this, he decided to address the mismatch not by words, not by gifts in the conventional sense, but by the most extravagant and most literal possible act of remediation. He would bring the mountain to Babylon. He would build in the heart of the flat plain in the centre of the world's most powerful city, a version of the vertical, green, water-abundant world his wife's body missed, close enough to the reality to provide, if not a cure for the homesickness, which nothing away from home can cure completely, at least a deep and daily consolation, a reliable place of return for the part of her that would always, on some level, be in the mountains. Whether or not this story is literally true, and the historians who will argue over it in the future centuries will not come to consensus, it is true as a description of the human need the garden meets, because what the garden provides for Ametis in the story and for every person who has walked its terraces in the long decades of its existence is exactly this: the particular sensory environment of a world more various, more vertical, more alive with water and growth and green shade than the world immediately outside the garden's walls. It provides, for the duration of a visit, the experience of being somewhere else, not through illusion, not through artifice in the theatrical sense, but through the real construction of a real environment with real plants and real water, and real bees and real shade, environment that is not native to this place and therefore carries in it always a slight quality of the miraculous, a slight quality of the wished for. This is what the great gardens of history have always done. They have always been at some level the expression of a longing a longing for a kind of world more beautiful, more ordered, more abundant, more sheltered than the world as it actually presents itself, a longing for the world as it might be or might have been, might yet become if sufficient care and intelligence and love were applied to the project of making it so. Every garden is a revision of the world. Every garden is the expression of the human refusal to accept that the world as given is the world as it must be. The insistence that the world can be improved, can be made more hospitable, more beautiful, more full of growing things and water sounds and the smell of jasmine in the evening air. The Queen. The story walks in the garden in the evening. She walks slowly, without the purpose of the gardeners or the focused attention of the astronomer. She walks the way people walk in gardens, the way you're walking in it now, with the half-attentive, receptive openness of someone who has come here not to do anything but to receive, to let the garden do what it does. Allow its sensory fullness to fill her in the same way that water fills whatever vessel it is poured into, completely, without remainder, the vessel and the water becoming for the duration of the filling a single thing. She pauses at the balustrade of the upper terrace and looks out over the city spread below her and beyond it to the flat, darkening plain that reaches in every direction to horizons she cannot see from here, and beyond those horizons invisible from Babylon, unreachable by any ordinary journey from this particular life she inhabits, the mountains of her first world. Their peaks in winter holding snow whose existence she remembers in her hands, in the specific remembered sensation of cold stone and cold water and cold clear air at altitude. She cannot see them from here. But she can smell very clearly from the jasmine on the terrace wall beside her, something that is not the mountains but is somehow adjacent to them in the system of associations her memory maintains, something fresh, something cool, something green, something that speaks to the part of her that left the mountains and never entirely arrived in Babylon. It is not the mountains, but it is something. It is a king's love given form, longing met, not solved but companioned, not ended but made more beautiful. And she stands at the balustrade in the evening, with the jasmine beside her and the city below, and the invisible mountains beyond, and she breathes. Imagine, for a moment, vantage point that does not exist and cannot be reached directly above Babylon at this hour, at the height of perhaps 1,000 feet, looking down at the city spread below in the gathering dark. The Euphrates first, always the Euphrates first, because the city cannot be understood outside its relationship to the river that made this civilization possible and that the civilization has in turn transformed, redirected, and reorganized into a system of canals and irrigation channels and harbour basins whose collective length, if laid out in a straight line, would reach from Babylon to the coast of the sea and back again. The river from this height would be a silver band, a reflective surface carrying the last light of the sky on its broad moving body, darker at the edges where the reeds grow and lighter in the centre where the current runs deepest and fastest. It would curve in its wide meander, as all great rivers curve, with the languid, self-contained grace of something that has been flowing for so long it has become indifferent to obstacles and simply moves around them, or through them, or over them, according to what the obstacle is and how long the river has to work on it. The city from this height would reveal its gridded structure clearly, the great avenues running north to south and east to west, their width distinguishing them even from above from the narrower residential streets, the processional way visible as a slightly wider, slightly more luminous band running from the Ishtar Gate toward the ziggurat, its pale stone catching the last ambient light more efficiently than the surrounding buildings. The ziggurat itself would be the most obvious feature, its stepped mass distinguishable even at this height by its scale relative to everything around it, its shadow at this hour thrown long and western and sharp-edged across the rooftops of the residential districts to its east. And the garden. The garden, from this imagined altitude, would be an anomaly of colour, a patch of deep, saturated green in the warm ochre and amber and pale cream of the surrounding city, unmistakable, almost hallucinatory in its vividness against the warm monotone of its context. The canopy of the first terrace trees would be visible as rounded masses of dark green, their individual crowns distinguishable only at the margins, merging toward the center into a continuous leafy surface that moves very gently in the evening breeze, visible from above as a slow, uniform ripple passing across the canopy from west to east. The flower terraces would be visible as lighter areas within the garden structure, the pale yellows and roses and whites of the flowers catching the last horizontal light and returning it upward in a general warm glow. The water channels catching the sky would trace their paths through the structure as thin lines of silver. From this height, in this hour, the city and the river and the garden would form a composition of extraordinary completeness, a composition in which every element makes sense in relation to every other element, which the geometry of the streets and the curve of the river and the elevated green of the garden are all legible as the parts of a single coherent human intention. The intention to make a place that is both functional and beautiful, both adequate to the demands of housing and feeding and governing a large population, and also worthy of the human capacity for aesthetic experience, for the pleasure of well-proportioned spaces and carefully considered materials and the specific quality of evening light on moving water. The stars would be visible from this altitude before they are visible from the city itself, the very first stars of the evening appearing in the deep eastern sky where the dark is already most complete, the sky there having shifted from blue to a deep blue-violet, in which the brightest stars emerge one by one, like thoughts that become clear as the noise around them diminishes. The astronomer, his tower, would already have found the first of them and pressed their positions into his clay. The garden, below, settling into its night. What this imagined elevation gives you, what this perspective from above offers that the ground-level experience cannot, is the gift of context, the ability to see simultaneously the thing and the world in which the thing exists, understand not just what the garden is in itself, but what it means in the larger composition of the city and the river and the plain and the sky. And what it means, seen from above, is this, that among all the categories of human building, the walls, the temples, the palaces, the warehouses, the bridges, the canals, the garden alone is the element that refuses the city's dominant logic of horizontality and enclosure and instead aspires upward, reaches for the sky, insists on introducing into the city's controlled human-scaled environment the wild fact of growing things, the uncontrolled beauty of living systems, the reminder that the city, however magnificent, is not sufficient to itself, that something in human beings requires the presence of the natural world, the world of plants and water and bees and birds, the world that existed before the city and that will exist in some form after it. The garden is the city's humility, the city's acknowledgement that it is not everything, that it cannot provide everything, that among all the things it can offer its inhabitants, protection, commerce, religious ritual, administrative order, the pleasures of urban life, it cannot offer them the thing they miss, the thing the body misses when it has been too long away from growing things and moving water and open air. The garden is the city's attempt to answer that missing, to fold a piece of the non-human world inside the human world with sufficient care and skill, that it is not diminished by the folding, that it retains its quality of wildness even while being tended, its quality of gift even while being managed, its quality of grace even while being engineered. This is perhaps the most important thing the Hanging Gardens of Babylon ever built, was not the garden itself, but the understanding it represents, the understanding that a civilization that tends growing things, that makes space within its walls for water and green, and the unhurried pace of biological processes, is a civilization that has remembered something essential about what human beings are and what human beings need. The stars, above Babylon, know nothing of this. They proceed in their appointed paths with the pure, impersonal magnificence of things that do not need to be understood to be beautiful. But the astronomer watching them is making them understood, tone clay tablet at a time. And the garden below, breathing in the dark, making beauty understood in the only way it can, by being, persistently and completely, beautiful. The garden at night is different from the garden in the afternoon. Not lesser different, A different chapter of the same long, patient story the garden has been telling all day, the same story told now in a different key, with different instruments, in the particular mode of the night, rather than the particular mode of the afternoon. The light is gone, or not gone, but transformed, replaced by the ambient light of the stars and the low, warm, amber-orange glow of the city's 1,000 fires, reflected off the base of a thin layer of cloud that has drifted in from the north in the hour since sunset, so that the underside of the sky glows faintly, providing a kind of indirect, diffuse illumination that does not create shadows the way sunlight does but rather softens everything, reduces contrast, gives all the surfaces of the garden a quality of gentle, uniform presence in the near dark. The temperature has dropped. Not precipitously, not in the sharp way that temperature drops on clear desert nights when the heat of the day rises directly into an unclouded sky and is gone. Tonight's drop is more gradual, more gentle, because the thin cloud layer holds some of the day's warmth at lower altitude, and the garden itself, all that dense biomass, those thousands of leaves and roots and stems that have been absorbing and storing the day's heat, continues to release its stored warmth slowly into the surrounding air, making the garden several degrees warmer than the surrounding city streets at this hour, the way any densely vegetated space is warmer on a cool night than the paved surfaces around it. The smell of the garden at night is the smell of the garden in a different condition. The volatile aromatic compounds of the herbs, which the day's heat kept in continuous release into the air, are now being released more slowly, settling rather than rising, concentrating at nose level rather than dispersing into the afternoon warmth. So the herb garden's smell in particular has intensified in a specific way. The wormwood's sharp silver bitterness, the hyssop's clean, slightly penetrating quality, the myrtle's dark and complex note, all of them more present, more distinct, more easily identified in this still, cool, concentrated evening air than they were in the warm, diffuse afternoon. The roses, too, are different at night. The rose scent, which was warm and full and slightly heavy in the afternoon heat, has become at this hour something lighter and more transparent, something that carries further on the cooler air, reaching you from further away with more clarity and less weight. The water in the channels is still moving. This is somehow surprising, or rather it is comforting in the specific way that the continuation of a reassuring thing is comforting, the way a fire continuing to burn through the night is comforting, not because you feared it would go out, but because its continuation is a small, ongoing act of reliability in the world. The sound of the water at night in the quieter acoustic environment of the sleeping city below is more audible than it was in the afternoon. And it has become, or perhaps you are now more able to perceive that it always was, the foundational sound of the garden's night, the sound upon which all the other night sounds rest. Owl somewhere in the upper canopy, the very occasional sound of a night foraging insect finding a late flower, the barely perceptible sound of the breeze moving through the leaves, a sound that is more felt than heard, a tactile sensation transmitted through the sound apparatus rather than the skin. You are sitting on the stone bench in the herb garden again. You have been here for a while now, long enough for the bench's stored warmth to have transferred itself to your body, long enough for your eyes to have fully adapted to the available light, long enough for the transition from the afternoon's abundance of sensation to the night's more spare and subtle offering to have been completed, for the night's version of this place to have become as real and as present to you as the afternoon's version was. The stars, now that your eyes are fully adjusted, are extraordinary. They are more numerous than they seemed at first, more numerous than you can count or even attempt to count. The sky as seen from this open-topped section of the third terrace, framed by the terrace walls and the silhouettes of trees, filled with a density of stars that the city's general glow only slightly diminishes, a density that creates the impression not of individual points of light on a dark background, but of a continuous luminous field from which certain points have been removed, field of light in which the dark patches are the anomalies and the stars are the baseline. The Milky Way runs its broad, slightly luminous river across the sky from one horizon to the other, its diffuse glow distinguishable from the dark around it only when you avoid looking at it directly. When you allow your peripheral vision, more sensitive to low light levels than the focused center of the eye, to receive it, the astronomer would name each significant star for you, give it its Babylonian designation, describe its position in the constellation figures that the Babylonian skywatchers have drawn across the star field over centuries of accumulated observation, the figures that will be inherited and modified by the Greeks, and then by the Romans, and then by the Arab astronomers of the Great Islamic Golden Age, and then by the European astronomers who will give them the names by which you know them now. Chain of transmission that will have carried the knowledge of a Babylonian stargazer in this city on this night right across the full span of recorded human history to you. But the astronomer is not here now. You are here now. And the stars are just stars unnamed, uncatalogued, magnificent in their indifference to the naming, magnificent in the way that all beautiful things are most themselves when simply allowed to be what they are without the intervention of interpretation or the anxiety of understanding. You breathe. The night air enters you, cool and clean and fragrant with the concentrated night scent of the herb garden, and something in you, some last remnant of the day's accumulated tensions, some residual vigilance that has been maintained since morning without your quite being aware of it, lets go, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the way that things let go in gardens at night, in the way that the body, given sufficient stillness and sufficient dark and sufficient of the smell of growing things and the sound of water, eventually arrives at the understanding that it is safe, that the night is not a threat but a rest, that the darkness is not an absence but a presence, a different kind of presence, quieter and more spacious and more patient than the day. You lean back. The stone is warm. The stars are everywhere. The water moves in its channel with its low, continuous, deeply reassuring voice. And the garden holds you in the particular way that only gardens can hold you, without arms, without words, without any claim on your attention or your gratitude, simply by being completely and generously and quietly what it is. You are very comfortable now. Your breath is slowing. The owl in the upper canopy asks its single, soft, unhurried question of the night. The water answers. The stars continue to arrive. The night deepens. Very slowly, in the way that the night always deepens when you're not watching it directly. Not by the sudden extinction of one quality of light and the installation of another, but by the patient, incremental accumulation of dark upon dark, the way the first hour of night is different from the second, and the second from the third, each one carrying a slightly greater stillness, a slightly deeper quiet, a slightly more complete withdrawal of the world's business into the intimate, private space of sleep. The garden is asleep. Not all of it, not entirely. The owls are awake, and the night-foraging moths that drift between the white flowers of the evening are awake, and the channels are still running, will run all night, the water making its eternal, circular journey from the river to the cisterns, to the channels, to the soil and back, a cycle that does not sleep and does not need to sleep because it is not the kind of thing that accumulates fatigue, not the kind of thing that requires the restoration that sleep provides. The water simply continues as the river continues, as the stars continue, as time itself continues in its patient, completely unhurried way. But the garden's human inhabitants are asleep. The gardeners are asleep in their quarters in the lower levels of the palace complex, their hands, even in sleep, carrying the memory of the day's work in their muscle and their skin, the faint persistent smell of soil and cut stems, the slight ache in the forearm that comes from a day of pruning, the warmth behind the eyes that comes from a long afternoon of close attention in the direct sun. They sleep the sleep of people who have done physical work in open air all day, which is one of the deepest and most restorative forms of sleep available to human beings, a sleep with no anxiety in it, a sleep that goes all the way down to the body's foundation. The water carriers are asleep. The beekeeper is asleep, and the bees are in their hives, clustered around the brood comb in the centre of the colony, their collective body heat maintaining the precise temperature required for the developing larvae, a temperature that does not vary, that the colony regulates with almost mechanical precision through the collective management of wing fanning and body positioning, an act of distributed biological intelligence that is happening right now in those 4 clay pipe hives on the 3rd terrace platform, quietly in the dark with no audience but the stars. Teanasir the scribe is asleep, and his tablets are drying on their stone shelf, the clay hardening in the cool night air, the cuneiform marks becoming more permanent with every hour, the information pressed into them making its slow transition from the malleable and provisional to the fixed and lasting. The astronomer is still awake, barely perhaps in the way of someone who has been awake a long time, and is approaching the point where continued wakefulness requires an active effort rather than simply the continuation of a natural state. He is pressing the last significant observation of the evening into his final tablet of the night, the stylus moving more slowly than it did 2 hours ago, the marks still precise, a quality of discipline embedded so deeply in the practice that it persists beyond the fading of conscious attention. But the intervals between marks slightly longer, the pauses for consideration slightly more frequent, evidence of a mind that has been doing careful work for many hours and is beginning to feel the weight of that. And you. You are on the bench in the herb garden, and you are not quite awake in the way you were an hour ago, and you are not quite asleep in the way you will be soon. And the space between waking and sleep that you currently occupy is one of the most beautiful spaces available to human consciousness, a space of complete physical ease and complete mental openness, space in which the sensory information of the world continues to arrive, but arrives now without any urgency, without any demand for response or interpretation, simply as sensation, simply as the pure experience of being a sensing body in a world full of things to be sensed. The smell of the night garden is all around you. It is the wormwood and the hyssop, cool and medicinal. It is the roses, lighter now, reaching you from further away in this still air. It is the jasmine on the terrace wall, whose evening fragrance is the strongest of all, as jasmine's always is, as though the jasmine knows that nighttime is its proper season, its most complete expression, and releases its fragrance at this hour with a generosity and a fullness that makes the entire dark garden smell, for a moment, like the air of a mountain meadow in the hour before dawn. It is the water, which has a smell, a clean, mineral, slightly cool smell that is the smell of water in stone, water in motion, water doing its ancient and essential work in the dark. And beneath all of these, the foundational smell of the soil, that dark, alive, completely patient smell that is the smell of everything that has ever lived and decomposed and become the medium in which new life grows. The smell of time itself made material and placed under your hands. Your breath slows. Your breath slows further. Each breath out is a little longer than the breath in, and this ratio, the longer exhalation, the fuller release, is the ratio of sleep, the ratio your body assumes when it is ready to cross the threshold from waking into the deep rest beneath waking, when the day has been fully lived and the night has been fully received, and there is nothing remaining to be done except to let go. The stars above the open terrace are still there. They are always still there. They were there before the garden was planted, before the first stone of the first terrace wall was laid, before the Euphrates began its long, patient work of making this plain out of the accumulated sediment of 10,000 years of flooding and deposit. They will be there after the garden is gone, after the walls of Babylon have returned to the earth from which their clay was taken, after the channels have silted and the cisterns have collapsed and the processional way has been covered by the patient accumulation of dust and the patient growth of new earth over old. The stars will be there as they are there now, carrying in their light the same ancient, impersonal, completely reliable beauty they have always carried, a beauty that asks nothing and promises nothing and simply is, continuously and permanently is the way water is, the way the deep soil is, the way the slow breathing of a sleeping garden is. You are almost asleep. You are almost asleep, and the garden knows this. And the garden does not mind. The water runs in its channel with its soft voice. The owl asks its question. The jasmine releases its night fragrance into the darkness. The stars hold their positions. The bench is warm. The city of Babylon breathes around you in its ancient, patient way, the way cities breathe at night, slowly, deeply, the 10,000 individual breaths of its sleeping population combining into a single, low, barely perceptible pulse of shared life, shared warmth, shared residence in this particular fold of time and earth and water. You breathe. You breathe, and the garden breathes with you, in and out, the leaves rising and falling in the microscopic respiration of their own chemical processes, the roots drawing water up through their vessels in the same slow, rhythmic capillary rise that has been happening since the first plant put down the first root in the first soil that was ever soft enough to receive it. In and out. In and out. The water runs. The stars remain. The garden holds you without arms, without words, with nothing but its ancient, patient, living presence, fragrant and warm and real and unhurried, the way the best places always hold you, the way home holds you, the way sleep is holding you now, gently, completely, with all the tenderness of something that has been waiting for you all this long, luminous, beautiful, ancient afternoon. Rest now. The garden is here. The garden will be here when you return. It has been waiting for you for a very long time. And it will wait for you again. Breathe. And let the night of Babylon, soft as old silk, fragrant as jasmine in the dark, carry you gently, tanned completely, and without effort, the way down into the deepest, most golden, most restoring sleep. The water runs. The stars hold their light. The garden breathes. Sleep. Welcome to Sleepy History with Henry. Here, we harness AI to breathe new life into authentic historical records, creating an immersive auditory experience. This entire production is AI-assisted, crafted solely for relaxation and sleep support. Tanned is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Please do not listen while driving or operating machinery. Now, let Henry and AI guide you on a peaceful journey through the past.